are there conversations between the administration and the Canadians going on over this tariff? Because the Ontario Premier says the next step is to cut off electricity to the U.S.
And the president put out a statement after seeing those comments and said that it would be there would be grave consequences imposed on Canada if they think about shutting off electricity for the United States.
Doug Ford did something very similar. He opportunistically called a provincial election. There was no need to do so. He already had a fairly fresh mandate. He said he was going to fight back for Ontario. He never really explained how, other than his promise to borrow, tax, and spend more money, sort of like COVID emergency spending. It was sort of muddled messaging, but he caught his two opponents off guard and he won. But instead of declaring victory, he went back to the battlefield and he started talking tough towards Trump in a way that I thought was quite odd. He said, for example, that he wasn't just going to put tariffs on U.S.-bound energy. An export tariff is a really weird thing for energy, don't you think? But he was actually threatening to turn off electricity with a smile on his face. Here's him saying that.
Let me be clear. I will not hesitate to increase this charge. If necessary, if the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely. Believe me when I say I do not want to do this. I feel terrible for the American people because it's not the American people who started this trade war. It's one person who's responsible. That's President Trump. I'd rather be working together. I want to sell the U.S. more energy, more electricity, more critical minerals. I want to make Canada and the United States the richest, most successful, safest, most secure two countries on the planet. But as Premier, my number one job is to protect the people of Ontario.
You know, Israel sometimes turns off electricity to the Gaza Strip. You might be saying, what? Israel supplies Gaza with its electricity? Of course. You don't think Hamas actually invests in civilian infrastructure, do you? Israel supplies Gaza with food, supplies Gaza with water, with healthcare, with many other things. It's only in rare occasions do they turn off electricity. They happen to be in a war with Hamas in Gaza. They turn it off and they're denounced roundly. This is a crime against humanity. At least that's what it's called when it's Israel turning off the electricity to Gaza. But Doug Ford thought he would try that on our best friends and customers and neighbors. It's one thing to put a tax or a tariff on things, but to actually turn off the electricity to schools, to hospitals, does that even work in trade? I mean, it's surely illegal under our trade agreements, but that is what Doug Ford said he would do. And he gave a series of interviews with U.S. media where he basically said, I'm going to bring the battle to the United States. Here's an example of one of those interviews.
And joining us now is Doug Ford, the Premier of Canada's most populous territory, Ontario. And Premier Ford, as we mentioned, President Trump is now saying he is enacting a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum from Canada, which will go into effect tomorrow in response to your actions. What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I start every interview with saying we love Americans. I love Americans, spent 20 years of my life there. And I know Canadians love Americans and vice versa. In saying that, we will not back down. We will be relentless. I apologize to the American people that President Trump decided to have an unprovoked attack on our country, on families, on jobs, and it's unacceptable. Let's work together. Let's get to the table if he has issues, and let's sort this out. You see the market tumbling. Consumer confidence is down. And if he continues on with this, assembly plants in Michigan will shut down and around the country, whoever makes autos. And as well as businesses, they're going to hurt. And these pensions, when the market goes down, it's going to affect people's pensions.
Now, just to stop for a second, an electricity export tax is crazy. It's illegal. And it would most likely push America off Canadian electricity. And I think that fairly quickly they would find domestic sources of electricity. I could be wrong on that. But shutting off electricity altogether, that really is tantamount to an act of war. By the way, that's similar to what Russia has done several times historically to Ukraine by turning off the natural gas pipelines. They certainly did that in 2014. And they never tried that during the Cold War, I should tell you, but Russia has done that to Ukraine several times in the last 20 years. Why? Why was Doug Ford acting as a de facto foreign minister for Canada? Canada's own foreign minister, Melanie Joly, has not been engaging with the U.S. I don't think they really have a lot of time for her. She prefers to go over to Europe and hang out with the other middle-aged feminist defense ministers and foreign ministers like Kaja Kallas. They have sort of a girl power club over there where they talk about things that they find interesting, none of which happens to be the Canada-U.S. trade agreement. That involves math and stuff. So while Justin Trudeau has been doing whatever he's doing, and Mark Carney is busy being selected as our new prime minister, I think Doug Ford sort of filled the void. And he filled the void in a very newsworthy way. He was saying things that would obviously attract attention, and they did, in fact, get the attention of the White House. Here's the White House press secretary talking about them today.
Are there conversations between the administration and the Canadians going on over this tariff? Because the Ontario Premier says the next step is to cut off electricity to the U.S.
And the president put out a statement after seeing those comments and said that it would be there would be grave consequences imposed on Canada if they think about shutting off electricity for the United States of America and our citizens. And the president is also determined to ensure that we are depending on American electricity, not the electricity production of foreign nations, including our allies in Canada. As for conversations, there is continued correspondence between the president's team, particularly Secretary Lutnick, and the Canadians as well.
Well, it's true. If Canada, if Ontario actually did shut the power off to the United States, it would bring grave consequences to Canada. Would Doug Ford actually do that? Could he even do that logistically? Would it even happen? I don't know. And how would it be handled on the U.S. side? What would Trump do in return? I don't know. I think the whole thing is so ludicrous and absurd, but look what it got done.
Well, just a little while ago, I had an opportunity to speak to Secretary Lutnick. And Secretary Lutnick has sent out an olive branch to us to come down and immediately meet with him, meet with the whole trade administration, and discuss the future. Rather than waiting till April the 2nd, threats going back and forth, tit for tat, I've agreed to suspend temporarily, and we always have that tool in our toolkit, until we sit down over the next day or two. I'll be heading down to Washington along with Dominic LeBlanc, and we'll have a good discussion.
Howard Lutnick, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, spoke to Doug Ford on the phone, and Ford is going to be down in Washington in 2 days' time. They put out a tweet to that effect, and both sides have decided to, hold their fire at least until then. So maybe you could say that Doug Ford's crazy wild man negotiating, maybe it worked. Maybe it was actually Trump style enough that it worked. I don't know. We'll find out soon enough. I don't think that Trump or Lutnick are used to dealing with someone quite like Doug Ford. When the president of Colombia got a bit stroppy online and refused to accept returning deportees from the United States, Trump immediately put sanctions on the president of Colombia and his family and his party, and the president of Colombia caved in less than 1 hour. I don't think the same dynamic is at play in Canada, but we'll see. I know one thing about Trump is he prefers to have arguments behind closed doors rather than in public. In fact, that was his main complaint with Vladimir Zelensky. Remember when Zelensky visited the White House and started criticizing J.D. Vance? And Vance's first reaction was, "We don't want to litigate this in public." Here's the clip.
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you are
Mr.
not
President,
strong...
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
That's J.D. Vance's way of saying, let's argue. But let's argue when we're alone, not when every camera is on us, because that makes it impossible to later have a rapprochement. So we'll see. Maybe Doug Ford is coming to Washington. But the thing is, Doug Ford doesn't have the power to give Donald Trump what he wants. If you take Trump at face value, he wants a stronger border, both to deal with migrants and with drugs. Doug Ford is really not in a position to do that, at least beyond his own Ontario border with the U.S., which is sizable to be sure. But Doug Ford is not in charge of foreign affairs. He's not in charge of borders. He's not in charge of the military. He can do some things, but he is not the one to solve that problem. Trouble is, Parliament is not in session. Trudeau ran away. Here's a goofy picture of him sticking his tongue out, taking his chair out of Parliament. Very odd. He leaves Parliament as bizarrely as he entered it. Melanie Joly can't get her calls answered, so we really don't have a government and we don't have a foreign policy right now. We'll see. Listen, I hope that this whole trade war fight with the States goes away. But I think, objective enough to acknowledge that Donald Trump's demands are not actually crazy. It's crazy to cut off electricity. It's crazy to choose a trade war instead of fixing the border. Stop the fentanyl. Stop the illegal immigration. Maybe chip in a bit more to NATO. Come up with a real reason why U.S. banks can't open in Canada or let them in. And yeah, U.S. dairy being kept out of Canada is a big irritant. And frankly, it's an irritant for Canadians too. We pay twice the price for eggs, poultry, dairy than Americans do. And we have much less selection and quality. So the things that Trump wants are actually not negatives for Canadians. You simply have the moral hazard of first Justin Trudeau and next Mark Carney preferring to fight than to make a deal. They prefer to fight for their own political fortunes than for the economic fortunes of all. Oh, hi, it's Ezra Levant here in Toronto with an important message because we need your help. Independent journalism in Canada is under attack. Government censors, big tech deplatformers, and the dying legacy media are all working together to maintain exclusive control on the information you receive. They don't want you to hear other voices like ours, and they really don't want you to be informed and to think for yourself. That's why the work we do here at Rebel News is so important. Our on-the-ground reporting, independent news shows, and special content you won't find anywhere else. It's all designed to give you trustworthy information and alternative viewpoints so you can decide for yourself. We don't get government money, and we are not owned by some big global conglomerate. We're funded by people just like you, so please support independent journalism and help us continue our work by subscribing and becoming a Rebel News Plus member today, right here on the page. Go to rebelnewsplus.com.